Thank you for joining us on the channel. We are continuing in this video in the book of Ruth. In fact, we are entering the text of the book of Ruth. If you are with us again, you know that the last time we simply introduced the Old Testament book of Ruth. If you're new to the channel, well, you know the drill. Like and subscribe and all those sorts of things help us spread the word. But we are going to be diving into Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. We will read that text in just a moment and then dive into some wonderful things from what in many ways is a very difficult text. Not difficult to understand, but kind of just difficult to stomach because it's not a very pretty picture. But I want to introduce this video, these thoughts, with a reminder of a very famous movie. In fact, the very end of a movie, The Sound of Music. If you have watched that movie, and I assume many of you have, or most of you have, you may recall the very ending of that movie where you see that beautiful scene of the Von Trapp family walking across the crest of the mountains. But even though it's a very beautiful scene, what it represents is kind of both tragedy and hope. The tragedy is, of course, they're leaving everything behind. They are running away from Nazi Germany. They are leaving behind their homeland. They're leaving behind all sorts of things. But of course, the hope is that they are together, that they are seeking asylum and safety and all of that. But they do that. They leave all that behind, all the difficulty behind, but also all their comforts behind, because they feel it's worth it to remain safe. Well, when you come to the text of the book of Ruth, the escape, as it were, happens not at the end of the scene. It happens at the beginning. It's sort of one of those things, almost like while the opening credits are rolling to the book, you're thinking, is this the end of it? Because someone is running away from something. And it's also not for political reasons that a family flees. It's due to their very need for survival in very, very poor climate conditions. And the scene only gets darker from there. We're going to read Ruth 1, verses 1 through 5, and then kind of walk through the text. I've got my Bible here, my notes here, and we'll walk through the text with some lessons for us, a grasp of the text, and then some lessons for us also. Ruth 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These, that is the sons, took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Now, if we didn't know the rest of the book of Ruth, this would be a very depressing lesson. And this text is depressing. There's no way around it. But we're going to think about these verses in this video because they set the stage for what will be one of the great stories of redemption and God's providence in the entire narrative of Scripture. Having told us that this narrative takes place in the time of the judges, and by the way, if you didn't watch the introductory video, I hope that you will, because we spend quite a bit of time really dealing with that, the setting and all of that first phrase of the book, the time when the judges rule the land. But having told us that, then, we're kind of already expecting bad news, because if we've read Judges, we kind of grasp that. But the author of Ruth wastes no time in telling us just how devastating and difficult the situation was. Famine had overtaken the land. Now, it's of interest that the inspired writer did not need to define which land is under consideration, because to the original readers, simply using the phrase the land would only mean Israel, the promised land. But there was seemingly no such famine, or at least not to the extent, in the bordering country of Moab, which was to the south, if I'm going to be really technical, sort of the south and southeast of Israel. And that has led some scholars to at least guess that the famine under consideration, the one in Israel, might be directly tied to that opening phrase in Ruth. After all, when the people fell into sinful rebellion during the time of the judges, God would allow them to suffer. And so it's possible that this famine was caused naturally, as famines were quite common in the Old Testament times. But it's also at least possible, and I'm not pushing for this, but it's worth thinking about, it's possible that this famine was a result of punishment for sin. Maybe the raiding of a foreign army or something like that. But whatever it was, the stage then is set further, and we're told that we're dealing with a small family from Bethlehem. This book is not going to deal with all of Israel, or even all of a tribe, or even really all of a city, although the city of Bethlehem will play a part later in the book a little bit. But instead, we're just told it's about a family. But at first, none of the people are named. We'll get to them in a second, their names. But at first, we're just told that there was a man and his wife and his 2 sons. Now, they're from Bethlehem, which literally means the house of bread. And so there's a famine that's causing the very name of the city to be tragically ironic. Now, it wasn't rare for that town to suffer from famine, ironically enough. Bethlehem will suffer from a few. In fact, famine was a very common thing in Bethlehem, sadly, at least at that time. And so that plays into this. So you have a famine, you have a family, you have all of this. And so trying literally to stay alive, the man moves his family to that country of Moab. That is the one that's south or southeast of Israel. And even here, though, a contrast is given, because we're told that they're going to sojourn in Moab. You see that again in verse 1. And while it seems they had been settled in Bethlehem, in other words, that was home, they were content to live wherever they could in Moab in order to find food. That term sojourn also at least seems to indicate to some degree that the plan was not to stay all that long in the foreign land. Everything about this opening description is meant to show desperation, but also a family that's just trying to do what they could to survive. Now, historically, Moab was not as apt to famine, at least not as severely, but it also was not as if this family moved to just some oasis. In fact, John MacArthur, in his book 12 Ordinary Women, in the chapter about Ruth, writes this, quote, Moab was a mostly desolate region, a high tableland bounded on the west by the Dead Sea and on the east by arid desert wasteland. Moab was fertile, but dry, and therefore the land was largely destitute of trees, good mostly for grazing flocks and herds, end quote. But more than the physical conditions or the climate conditions, the move to Moab was a move to a land that historically, well, it had been an enemy of the Israelites, very strongly so. Even though they came from the same ancestors, if I've got this correct, Moab was a second cousin to Jacob. Their history was at best testy, and at times it was tremendously heated. This is probably not a full list, but there are at least 4 historical occasions throughout the Old Testament where you see this difficult relationship, this strained relationship between Israel and Moab. Number 1, in Deuteronomy chapter 23, it was the Moabites who did not allow Israel to pass through their land while the Israelites were leaving Egypt and heading toward the Promised Land. Number 2, in Numbers chapter 25, while God's people were wandering in the wilderness, women from the nation of Moab had basically seduced the men of Israel, and having done that, the women caused the men to be part of sacrificing to Moabite idols. 3, in the more well-known story of Balak, the king of Moab, he had tried to pay off, as it were, a prophet of God named Balaam. But why did he want to do that? To send curses on Israel. That's in Numbers 22 to 24. And then even now, number 4, in those days when the judges ruled, there was a struggle. Ferguson writes in his commentary quote, about this, quote, Eglon, the infamously fat king of Moab, had defeated Israel and made her a vassal people for 18 years until the left-handed Ehud, the Benjaminite, was raised up by God to deliver them, end quote. And you find that account, of course, in Judges chapter 3. So you have this historical strain, testiness between Israel and Moab. But even beyond that, it is the worship of what we might call the national god of Moab that should cause us to wonder just how desperate this family in Ruth really was. The worship of, I've heard it pronounced Chemosh and Chemosh, was nothing short of horrifying. While very sexualized imagery and many practices that could be considered crude were part of the worshipful practices, what most people remember and hopefully recoil at is that the worship of this particular false god also at times included human sacrifice. John Phillips, in an online article about this, wrote this, quote, Chemosh had his terrible place on a platform of movable stones under which great fires could be kindled. Chemosh's lap was so constructed that little children placed on its red-hot surface would roll down an inclined plane into its fiery belly, end quote. And so one writer then stated it very bluntly, quote, the Moabite culture practically epitomized everything faithful Israelites were supposed to shun, end quote. In other words, they were the polar opposite of what the Israelites were supposed to be. And so it's no wonder then that this family from Bethlehem, we're told in the text, was going to sojourn. That is, not permanently settle in this hostile, pagan, idolatrous land. Now, moving to Moab may seem like a courageous decision by this family, and it might be, and we can put it that way. But it also possibly was more of a decision made of fear, and it can be argued, and it's up for you to think about and study about and all that. It can be argued that it may have been even made due to a lack of faith. Because to dwell where God has placed his blessing, even in difficult times, is a decision of faith. Listen to the 91st Psalm, verses 1 and 2. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust, end quote. Now, we live in different times where our physical location is not so much tied to our faithfulness to God. But it is interesting that these people move when the Old Testament continually talked about being within the presence of God in a physical way, not literally in his presence, but I mean is in the land, as it were, in his presence. If this was a serious and unwise decision, then why would it be so? Well, again, I want to go back to Ferguson's commentary, Sinclair Ferguson. He summarizes it fairly well, I think. He said this, quote, in the Old Covenant, there were particular geographical spaces and times that God had designated as holy. These were specific places where God promised to meet his people. Eventually, they formed a series of concentric circles: the Promised Land, the city of Jerusalem, the temple, and at the center, the Holy of Holies. The Promised Land was the one place on earth where, whatever happened, you could be safe under the shadow of the Almighty, end quote. Now, the one thing to keep in mind from that quote, of course, is that in Ruth, we are before the time of the temple. But the comment about geographic locations still stands. Within the land of Israel, there were these sacred places that were holy, and people were to stay near to that location to stay within the sphere of influence of God and within his protective presence. But then, as these verses unfold, the story only gets worse. Because in just 5 verses, the book of Ruth goes from a very quick setting of the time frame when the judges ruled the land to completely shocking our system. If a famine and moving to a pagan land was not difficult enough, verses 2 through 5 are so fast moving that they introduce the reader to 6 people by name, and half of the 6 are dead by the end of verse 5. Now, while a decade passes in time, verse 4 tells us, the inspired writer seems to want the reader's mind to just be spinning at the emotional toll that these people in particular are going through, and especially the women in this text. After simply calling someone a man in verse 1, we're finally given his name, Elimelech, in verse 2. That name means, my God is king. Now, some have suggested that he was a man of some influence because near the end of the book, the leaders of the city of Bethlehem honor his memory by calling him our relative, or some translations have our brother. That's in Ruth chapter 4 and verse 3. But the rest of this family that's fleeing is also named. Naomi, which means pleasant, and that will come back to play later in the book, of course, will remain a main figure for the rest of the book. In fact, it can be argued that she is the main figure of the book instead of Ruth. We can argue that all day long, but for certain, I would challenge you to do this. Sometime read through the book of Ruth through the lens of Naomi. In other words, read it as if she's the main character, main human character. And it doesn't necessarily read differently, but you'll think of the book a little bit differently. It's an interesting way to approach this book. 2 sons are also part of this family. Mahlon, a name that means sick, and Chilion, a name that means pining, also, of course, move with their parents. We're not told how old these sons are when this move happens, but they are old enough to get married in Moab during this time frame that elapses in the opening 5 verses. I think it would be proper to say that they were in, we might call, the prime of life, but by the end of these verses, they've passed away, they're dead. And we don't know if they were killed, if something connected with the famine took their lives, in other words, they were sick when they left. We don't know what happened. But both of these young men are gone just as quickly as they enter the narrative, but enter in two others. Because while living in that foreign land before they pass away, the two sons marry. And it's stated in a matter of fact fashion, but to the Jewish reader it would have been somewhat shocking, if not scandalous, that the two sons took Moabite wives. Now keep in mind that due to issues, again, we've mentioned already, way back in Deuteronomy chapter 23, it made it clear that there was supposed to be severe punishment for this sort of thing. Listen to Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 and 4. No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and with water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam the son of Beor from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you. But now, since this family has left to go to Moab, which could possibly, and again, I'm not pushing for this, but it's worth thinking about, it could possibly show at least a lack of trust in God. Is it really that unlikely that they would marry women from that land, no matter how pagan they might have been? After all, you marry people that you're around. And tragically, that often comes with a compromise of, if not an outright repudiation of, moral principles. I'm not saying Mahlon and Chilion did that. It is worth thinking about, though, that is possible. Now, the three women form the core of the remainder of chapter 1 of the book of Ruth. But at this point, just see them for where they are in this life, because this is where we're going to leave off in this account of these very negative, frankly, 5 verses. Because in that ancient culture, Naomi and Orpah and Ruth are, well, they're bereft of hope. A widow at that time, especially someone of age like Naomi, was basically in a hopeless situation. While it's hard in our times for a widow, in that culture, it was tragic. It was often extremely dangerous. Steve Zeisler, in his commentary on Ruth, wrote this, quote, "There was no Social Security, no welfare system, no government safety net, no life insurance," end quote. Now, that may sound strange to our ears. Women in that culture were nearly helpless without a man, either a husband or a grown son, in order to care for them. You even see that reference in New Testament times in 1 Timothy chapter 5, and I invite you to read that text, especially about verse 3 through verse 16. But now, way back in Ruth's time, Naomi's time, these women are without husbands. In Naomi's case, they're without grown sons that she had and now doesn't. Now, as people who love the Bible, we would expect there to be some kind of voice from heaven at this point. Maybe, as with the parents of Samson, also the time of the judges, there would be a message from the angel of the Lord. Or maybe, as in the case of Moses earlier, there would be a burning bush or some other phenomenon to show God's presence with, especially Naomi, the one who came from Israel. But as far as it goes in the text, there's silence. Now, the narrative will just continue in quite matter-of-fact fashion. But in that, though, there's power for our lives when we read this short book. Because today, we will not have a burning bush. We will not have what scholars like to call a theophany, where God speaks directly or God appears directly to us. But God knows what we're going through, and God cares what we're going through. And it's also worth noting as we begin to wrap up, that if we read these opening 5 verses carefully, there have been some very unwise decisions made, possibly some sinful decisions made. And while Naomi will, for lack of a better term, convert Ruth later in chapter 1, that hasn't occurred yet. It would seem that her faith was shaken to some degree, if not downright weak at this point. Now, thankfully, Naomi's faith will grow as the narrative continues. There'll be some ups and downs, but overall it will grow. But just for now, consider the very modern nature of this opening paragraph. Yes, it's tragic, but because of that, we can see ourselves in it to some degree. We lose people we love. We sometimes feel hopeless. Yes, we sometimes make unwise decisions and maybe even sinful decisions. And we do not hear a direct word from heaven. Now, we may not be in Moab, but we have dark days and dark seasons. Yet God is always working, even in ways we don't see, in ways we cannot fathom, even in times when our faith is weak or shaken. We cannot lose our faith. In fact, there are times when those darker moments can be a reason to grow our faith, if we'll allow that to happen. We may not understand why God allows certain things to occur in our lives. But if we would just trust Him in those moments, we may just find that we're closer to Him when those seasons are past than we were before. So let me ask, are you facing a dark day or a dark season? How is your faith as you go through those valleys, those difficult times? Understandably, your faith may be strained and it may be shaken, but don't lose your faith. Because what the book of Ruth is going to remind us of is that God is working, even if we don't see it in the darkness, in the dark moments. I know this is a difficult text, very negative text, quite frankly, in a lot of ways, but it sets up the continuing beautiful story of the book of Ruth. And I hope you'll join us for the next video when we'll do a lot more in chapter 1 and begin to see some back and forth between Naomi and these daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. And I hope that you'll join us in the next video. We have some other videos that have come out or are coming out. Mary Carol and I released one. Mary Carol and Leah are releasing one in a few days. We have other things, kids' Bible songs coming out, and just a lot of stuff happening. And we're glad to pass it all along to you. So please take a moment and subscribe. We greatly appreciate that. Spread the word about what we're trying to do. Hope all these things encourage you and your family in your life of faith. And we'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.